Thunder cracked overhead, splitting the sky open and sending sheets of rain slashing across the endless green fields of the Cotswolds. Pembroke Estate, usually serene beneath the moon, had been transformed by the storm into a wild and haunting landscape. Trees along the ancient stone wall twisted in the wind, their branches clawing at the darkness. Out there, almost invisible in the blur of rain, a black stallion ran, not with the measured elegance of a show horse, but with something frantic, desperate in his stride. Wellington's hooves struck the soaked earth in a pounding rhythm, mud splattering high up his flanks, his breath streaming out in sharp, white clouds. Lightning flickered again, illuminating the stallion's silhouette, head held high, ears pinned back, muscles flexed and tense beneath his sleek coat. In the flash, his eyes caught the light, reflecting it like two molten coals. Every instinct in him screamed of danger, of something waiting just beyond the tree line. But Wellington didn't hesitate. He plunged on, racing toward the shadowy woods at the edge of Pembroke land, mane whipping behind him like a battle flag. Far behind, stumbling through the wet grass, Lady Charlotte Ashworth fought to keep Wellington in sight. Her dress, once pristine, was soaked through and clung to her legs, every step heavier than the last. Rain ran in rivulets down her face, stinging her eyes, but she pressed on, one hand clutching her lantern, the other raised to shield herself from the wind. "Wellington, wait!" Her voice was swallowed by the storm, but Charlotte didn't slow down. She'd known this horse since he was a colt, and she'd never seen him act this way, wild, almost haunted, as if he sensed something that no one else could. All evening, he'd paced his stall, tossing his head and pawing at the old oak door, until finally, with a scream of splintering wood, he'd burst out and vanished into the night. She couldn't let him disappear. Not now. Not after everything that had already been lost. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment Charlotte saw Wellington at the edge of the woods, framed against the writhing branches. The world seemed to freeze. Rain caught midair, thunder hanging unfinished. The horse stood poised, nostrils flaring, every muscle quivering. Then, without warning, Wellington let out a shrill, piercing whinny that echoed through the storm. Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest. She staggered forward, calling his name again, her boots slipping in the mud. For a heartbeat, she feared she'd lose him to the shadows. But Wellington turned, just enough for their eyes to meet, just enough for Charlotte to see the question, the warning burning in his gaze. He stamped his hoof, then vanished into the blackness beneath the trees. Charlotte stood frozen, every sense straining to follow him, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She wanted to run after him, but the woods at night were treacherous, especially with the rain turning every path to a river. Still, something in the way Wellington had looked at her, that almost human urgency, drove her on. She plunged into the trees, ducking beneath low branches, the lantern trembling in her grip. Branches snapped underfoot, the storm muffled now by the dense canopy overhead. Charlotte could barely see a foot ahead, the only light coming from the unsteady glow of her lantern. She stumbled through brambles and roots, her dress snagging, hair plastered to her cheeks. All around her, the wind howled and the trees groaned, but she listened for one sound only, the drum of Wellington's hooves, somewhere deeper in the dark. Suddenly, the ground dropped beneath her. Charlotte slid down a muddy bank, barely catching herself against a mossy log. She bit back a gasp, the lantern slipping from her hand and rolling into a patch of ferns. She scrambled after it, fingers closing around the warm metal just as a new flash of lightning lit up the world. There, at the bottom of the slope, stood Wellington. He was perfectly still now, head raised, ears straining. The rain sheeted off his back, but he seemed oblivious, utterly focused on something in the darkness ahead. Charlotte crawled closer, heart in her throat. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, voice trembling. Wellington pawed at the ground, nostrils wide. Charlotte followed his gaze, squinting into the trees. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, just at the edge of her vision, something moved. A flicker of pale color, a flash of movement in the undergrowth. Charlotte's breath caught. She edged closer, holding the lantern high. The light wavered over twisted roots and fallen leaves, catching on something metallic. A scrap of fabric, torn and muddy, snagged on a branch. The kind of fabric used in military uniforms. A chill raced through Charlotte, sharper than the rain. Suddenly, the full weight of the night crashed down on her. The storm, the horse's panic, the strange movement in the woods. It all seemed connected, a puzzle she hadn't realized she was a part of. Wellington whinnied again, softer this time, and pressed his muzzle to her shoulder as if urging her on. Charlotte stood up, determination stiffening her spine. Whatever had driven Wellington out into the storm, whatever he'd sensed in these woods, she would find it. She owed it to the horse, and to the man they both missed more than words could say. The thunder rumbled again, but Charlotte didn't flinch. With Wellington at her side, she stepped deeper into the darkness, not knowing that what they would find here tonight would change their lives, and the fate of Pembroke Estate forever. Freeze frame. Wellington standing alert at the threshold of the Black Forest. Lady Charlotte just behind him, rain lashing around them. In that suspended second, the narrator intones, "What Wellington discovered in the forest would change everything, forever." The world outside the Pembroke Estate seemed to dissolve into shadows and rain, but inside, memory took over, warm, golden, relentless. As Charlotte pressed forward into the woods with Wellington, her mind was pulled backward to a time before the storms, before the silence, before Wellington's wild dash into the night. It began with the roar of a crowd and the crisp snap of mallets against leather. Years earlier, under a sapphire sky, the Royal Polo Grounds had buzzed with anticipation. Charlotte remembered the brilliant white of the players' uniforms, the shimmer of the Queen's banner, and the high, proud line of the Pembroke horses as they were led onto the field. There, among them, a black colt barely old enough to compete, pranced nervously, his coat catching the sunlight and throwing it back like polished jet. This was Wellington, spirited, unbroken, the youngest entry in a field of seasoned champions. In the grandstand, Lord Alexander Pembroke, tall and striking even in his late teens, watched the young horse with a half-smile. The second son of the Earl, Alexander was known for his keen sense of duty and his unwillingness to simply fade into the shadow of his older brother's inheritance. Unlike the others, he did not see Wellington as just a promising asset, but as a soul much like his own, restless, determined, aching for something more. The day of that match, Alexander stepped into the ring with a calm that belied his age. He nodded at his fellow officers, all crisp in their Royal Horse Guards uniforms, but his attention never left Wellington, who pawed the ground, wild-eyed and uncertain. When Alexander climbed into the saddle, something shifted. Wellington settled beneath him, and for a moment, rider and horse became a single, fluid motion. They galloped, darted, turned as if anticipating each other's moves, the crowd's cheers fading into the background, the world shrinking down to heartbeats and hoofbeats. It wasn't just about the game. It was about trust, forged under pressure, cemented by a mutual sense of being outsiders in a world that demanded conformity. By the end of the match, Wellington had outpaced rivals twice his size, and Alexander had proven himself not just as a lord, but as a leader. Afterward, as the sun slipped behind the old willows at the edge of the field, Charlotte found Alexander by the stables, brushing the sweat from Wellington's flank. She was just a girl then, visiting from her family's estate, but the three of them, horse, soldier, and caretaker, formed an unlikely bond. Charlotte brought apples and soft words, Alexander brought discipline and a steady hand, and Wellington, in return, offered his trust. Years passed, and with them came the inevitabilities of duty. Newsreels spoke of growing conflict overseas. Alexander, now an officer in the Royal Horse Guards, announced over supper that he had volunteered for a tour in Afghanistan. The air in the Pembroke dining room grew heavy. The Earl stiffened, pride and worry battling across his face. Alexander's mother pressed her hand to her lips. Only Charlotte, meeting Alexander's eyes across the candlelit table, understood that he could never have chosen otherwise. The night before his departure, Charlotte found him in the stables, saddling Wellington for one last ride along the misty lanes of the estate. They rode in silence, the moon flickering through the hedgerows, the scent of wildflowers clinging to the damp air. Stopping at the old gatehouse, Alexander dismounted, pressed his forehead to Wellington's, and then turned to Charlotte. "Promise me you'll look after him." Charlotte's throat tightened, but she nodded. "He's more than just a horse," Alexander whispered, his voice low. "He's family. And you'll come back, won't you?" Alexander managed a small, crooked smile. "I'll always come back. For you. For him. For home." The next morning, Alexander was gone, swept up in the pageantry of deployment, the gold braid of his uniform gleaming in the sunrise as the Royal Guards marched out. The estate felt emptier with every day that passed. Letters arrived from the desert, spare, formal, edged with exhaustion and longing. Charlotte read them aloud to Wellington, who stood quietly, his ears flicking with each mention of his master's name. Time slowed, seasons turned, the countryside swelling with green in the summer and hardening under frost in winter. Charlotte's days fell into a pattern. Sunrise in the stables, Wellington's mane between her fingers, the routine of feeding, grooming, and waiting. Every afternoon, just as the sun tilted behind the village church, Wellington would walk to the iron gates at the end of the drive and stand, staring down the road that wound away toward the world. It became a ritual, one so constant that even the villagers began to notice. At the pub, whispers grew. Some called it touching, a sign of animal loyalty. Others shook their heads. Foolish, they said, a horse couldn't possibly understand. But every evening, as the sky streaked orange and pink, Wellington kept his silent vigil. Charlotte tried to distract him, new tack, longer rides, company from the other horses, but nothing worked. Wellington was waiting, and everyone knew it. As weeks stretched into months, hope began to wither. News from Afghanistan was never good for long. Reports of firefights and losses ran under Charlotte's skin like ice. One letter, the last she received, was different. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. Alexander wrote of dreams that seemed more real than waking, of the bond he felt with Wellington, and of a promise he would keep, no matter what. Charlotte tucked that letter into her apron pocket, reading it over and over until the paper softened at the creases. On the loneliest nights, when the wind keened around the eaves and the fire burned low, she'd sit with Wellington and whisper Alexander's words, both of them needing the comfort. Tonight, as the storm battered the estate and Wellington's sudden flight shattered the fragile calm, Charlotte felt the full weight of those memories pressing on her. Whatever was calling Wellington into the woods, whatever he sensed out there in the rain-soaked dark, it was tied to Alexander, to promises made and not yet broken. The past and present blurred together, and Charlotte, braver than she'd ever felt, plunged after Wellington with a hope she'd thought she'd lost. Unseen by either, the ancient oaks loomed overhead, witnesses to sorrow, longing, and, perhaps, the start of something miraculous. At Pembroke Estate, the passing of time was marked not by the ticking of clocks, but by the quiet rituals of devotion. Hoofbeats on cobblestones at dawn, the whisper of hay in the ancient stalls, the careful tending of wounds both visible and unseen. For Charlotte, each day bled quietly into the next, her world shrinking down to the stables and the shadow cast by Wellington's longing. In the months after Alexander's departure, hope clung to Charlotte like the last embers of a fire. She woke each morning to the sound of the countryside, crows in the distant fields, the clatter of the kitchen staff beginning their day, the gentle snort of horses stirring in their stalls. But it was Wellington who anchored her. Each morning, before the rest of the household had even taken tea, Charlotte walked the length of the gravel drive to the stables, boots crunching over the stones. Wellington would be waiting, dark and gleaming, already awake, ears flicking at the faintest sound of her approach. "Good morning, old friend." She'd greet him quietly, brushing the hay from his mane, fingers deft and gentle. There was comfort in the repetition, the currying, the feeding, the way Wellington pressed his muzzle into her shoulder, a silent reassurance that as long as she kept the routine, some part of the world would remain steady. Some mornings, she found herself talking to him about everything, about Alexander's last letter, about the endless English rain, about the smallest changes in the world beyond the estate walls. It was in the late afternoons that the routine turned bittersweet. After the horses were exercised and the stables swept clean, Wellington would wander toward the main gates, the ones framed by ancient yew trees and topped with the family crest. Without fail, he'd stand there, muscles still as marble, eyes fixed on the winding road that disappeared into the misty countryside. Sometimes Charlotte would join him, her own gaze stretching into the unknown. She imagined Alexander riding over the hill, uniform bright, a wave and a grin, the promise of return fulfilled. But the days wore on. Seasons shifted. Spring's wild daffodils gave way to the lush green of summer. Then the crisp scent of autumn drifted in on the breeze. And finally, the cold steel of winter pressed against the estate. Through it all, Wellington's vigil never broke. The villagers noticed, their whispers floating through the markets and pubs. Children pressed their faces to the iron gates, pointing at the black stallion who waited so patiently. Some people said Wellington was enchanted, a ghost horse waiting for a master who would never return. Others pitied Charlotte, a young woman clinging to hope like a shipwrecked sailor clutching driftwood. Charlotte learned to ignore the gossip, burying herself in the care of the estate. She wrote to Alexander each week, even when replies grew scarcer. She read the news, reports from the front, the mounting casualties, the names of fallen heroes, always searching for the one name she never wanted to see. The world outside seemed to spin on without her, but within the estate time had its own peculiar rhythm, dictated by Wellington's heart. On stormy evenings, she would sit in the tack room, reading Alexander's old letters by lantern light. Sometimes, when the wind howled through the rafters and rain battered the windows, she imagined she could hear Alexander's voice, steady and strong, cutting through the loneliness. She would read his words aloud to Wellington, who stood by her side, still and attentive, as if he too understood the ache in every line. "We're both waiting, aren't we, boy?" Sometimes Charlotte felt as if she was living in a dream, the kind that felt real until morning. She would wake, half expecting to see Alexander's boots by the door, his laughter echoing in the halls. But the reality was always the same. Just her and Wellington, keeping their silent vigil. One particular morning, as mist curled over the estate, Thomas Hartwell, the head butler, approached Charlotte as she brushed Wellington's coat. "You ought to take some rest, Miss Ashworth. He's not going anywhere," he said, his voice gentle but edged with concern. "Neither am I, Thomas," Charlotte replied, forcing a small smile. "I promised Alexander." Hartwell nodded, understanding more than he let on. He'd served the Pembrokes for decades, seen generations come and go, and yet he too had grown fond of the young lord and the horse who bore his name. The estate staff rallied around Charlotte in their own quiet ways, fresh flowers on her window ledge, an extra slice of cake after supper, a warm fire kept burning late into the night. It was their way of honoring the hope that flickered in the cold. Months turned to years. Wellington aged but never lost his spirit. He became a fixture in the village, the subject of legends whispered at twilight. Children brought him apples, old women tossed him sugar cubes, and local artists painted him in the golden light of dusk. The postman learned to slow his bicycle by the gate, offering Wellington a pat before moving on. Still, nothing could distract the stallion from his ritual, each evening waiting for the return of the one he loved. Sometimes Lady Pembroke would join Charlotte by the gate, their silhouettes outlined against the setting sun. Without words, they stood together, two women bound by love and longing, watching and waiting. Charlotte wondered what people saw when they looked at them: a grieving mother, a steadfast friend, a faithful horse. But she knew the truth. They were all keeping faith in their own way, refusing to let hope die, even as the world darkened around them. Inside the estate, the air grew heavier with every week that passed without news. The staff began to walk on eggshells, lowering their voices when Charlotte entered the room, glancing away when the post arrived. Yet through it all, Wellington's presence was a comfort, solid, unwavering, a living promise that love and loyalty could outlast even the longest silence. One night, as Charlotte tucked a worn letter into her apron and prepared to leave the stables, Wellington nudged her hand, his breath warm on her skin. She looked into his dark, steady eyes and felt a flicker of hope. Fragile, but real. "We'll wait together, won't we?" The storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but Charlotte and Wellington, standing in the last light of day, faced the coming darkness side by side, united by a hope that refused to break. And somewhere, far beyond the rolling hills of Pembroke, the story of their waiting was only just beginning. It began as a whisper on the morning breeze, a ripple of news that slid through the village, from the post office to the bakery, onto the farthest cottages at the edge of the Pembroke Estate. Charlotte heard the murmurs as she led Wellington back from his morning walk, his coat still damp from the early dew. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the whole countryside were bracing for a storm. Charlotte saw the way people glanced at her from behind drawn curtains, pity mixed with apprehension in their eyes. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the rhythm of Wellington's stride and the solid feel of the leather reins in her hands. But by midday, the tension had grown impossible to ignore. As Charlotte returned to the stables, Thomas Hartwell intercepted her at the door, his usually composed face shadowed by worry. "There's word from London, Miss Ashworth." He spoke in a low tone, as if trying to shield her from the very sound of it. "They say there was an attack in Afghanistan. The Royal Horse Guards, Alexander's unit, were involved." For a moment the world seemed to tilt, the stable walls closing in. Charlotte gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. She forced herself to nod, to breathe, to keep from unraveling right there in front of the staff. "Do we know anything more?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Hartwell shook his head, eyes dropping. "Not yet, miss. The major's come up from the barracks. He's with Lord Pembroke now." Charlotte's stomach tightened. Major Edmund Blackwood had always been a stern presence, a man of precision and duty, never one for sentiment. If he had come in person, the news could not be good. Trying to steel herself, Charlotte left Wellington in Hartwell's care and made her way to the main house. The corridors, usually echoing with laughter and the clatter of staff, were silent. In the drawing room, she found Lady Pembroke seated by the window, her hands twisting a handkerchief to shreds. Across from her, Lord Pembroke stood ramrod straight, his jaw clenched as he listened to Major Blackwood, who wore his uniform like armor and spoke in clipped, emotionless tones. Charlotte hovered in the doorway, unnoticed for a moment, her heart racing. "I regret to inform you," Blackwood was saying, "that Captain Pembroke's unit was ambushed on patrol. There are casualties. Your son's whereabouts are currently unknown." The silence that followed was suffocating. Charlotte felt herself sway, reaching for the doorframe again. Lady Pembroke let out a broken gasp, and Lord Pembroke's composure cracked just slightly, his voice rough as gravel. "My son is not dead. Not until you tell me otherwise." Blackwood gave a curt nod, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He did not expect a miracle. Charlotte slipped from the room before anyone could see her tears. She stumbled down the back stairs, out the kitchen door, and into the garden, gulping the sharp autumn air as if it might bring her back to herself. Her mind spun. Alexander missing. Not confirmed dead, but lost, out there in a place she could hardly imagine. She thought of his promise, of all the promises, and felt the first thread of hope fray inside her chest. That evening, Pembroke Estate shifted into a kind of haunted quiet. The staff spoke in hushed voices, the clocks seemed to tick more loudly. Even the dogs lay at the hearth, as if sensing their master's sorrow. Charlotte, unable to bear the stillness, retreated to the stables, seeking comfort in the company of Wellington. But Wellington was not himself. He had refused his evening oats, circling the stall with a restless energy that bordered on frantic. His dark eyes were wild, his ears twitching at every creak and whisper. When Charlotte tried to calm him, stroking his neck and speaking softly, he shied away, snorting and tossing his head. The other horses grew uneasy as well, stamping and whickering, their nervousness contagious. "What's gotten into you?" Charlotte murmured, worry bleeding into her voice. Wellington's agitation only grew as night fell. The wind picked up, rattling the stable doors and sending leaves skittering across the cobblestones. Wellington paced the length of his stall, then began to paw at the gate, as if determined to escape. He would lift his head and let out a long, mournful whinny, the sound cutting through the darkness and echoing all the way to the manor house. More than once, Charlotte caught him staring toward the distant woods, nostrils flared, body trembling as if he sensed something lurking just beyond the edge of sight. The villagers, too, sensed the strangeness. Some said it was a bad omen, a sign that something terrible had happened far from home. Others whispered of old legends, of the bond between a Pembroke and his steed, of horses who could sense their rider's fate even across an ocean. The estate's old gardener, Mrs. Fenwick, swore she'd seen Wellington standing at the gate in the dead of night, his coat gleaming in the moonlight, eyes fixed on the road as if waiting for someone who would never return. Days passed, but no word came. Alexander was still missing, his fate a question mark that cast its shadow over every heart at Pembroke. Charlotte clung to hope, reading and rereading his last letter until the ink faded beneath her tears. She threw herself into caring for Wellington, desperate to bring him back to himself, but nothing worked. He grew thinner, his appetite waning, his nights growing ever more restless. One night, as a fierce wind battered the estate, Charlotte heard a crash from the stables. She ran out into the darkness, lantern in hand, heart pounding in her chest. There she found Wellington rearing in his stall, eyes rolling with fear, sweat darkening his coat. "Easy, boy," she called, her voice trembling. But Wellington wouldn't be soothed. He broke away, circling and stamping, his distress reaching a fever pitch. It was as if he were calling out for Alexander, reaching for a bond that refused to break, no matter the distance. Charlotte watched him, her heart aching, and realized something deeper than grief was at work here. Wellington was warning them. She was certain of it. Something in the world had shifted. Some unspoken message passed between souls. She stood with him through the long hours of the night, the storm raging beyond the old stone walls, both of them waiting for a sign, for news, for a miracle, for a hope that would not die, no matter how dark the coming days might be. The storm rolled in with a violence that seemed almost unnatural, thunder rattling the ancient windows of Pembroke Estate, and wind tearing through the countryside with a banshee's wail. The night sky glowed white with lightning, illuminating the hills and the manor house in ghostly flashes. Every creature on the estate felt the change. Dogs whined and cowered. The stable cats vanished into dark corners, and the horses grew restless, stamping in their stalls and tossing their manes as if the air itself had turned hostile. Charlotte sat upright in her small attic room, the storm's fury shaking her from sleep. She glanced at the clock, just past midnight. Rain hammered against the glass, drowning out every other sound except the thunder's deep, angry voice. Her heart was already uneasy, never fully at rest since Alexander's disappearance. But tonight, that anxiety coiled into a sharper, nameless dread. She threw on her robe, hastily tied her boots, and hurried down the servants' stairs. As she reached the ground floor, she could already hear a commotion from the stables, louder than the storm, the unmistakable crash of wood and the frantic, high-pitched whinnies of a horse in distress. Without a second thought, Charlotte grabbed the nearest lantern and raced out into the rain. The world outside was a chaos of motion. Rain struck her face in hard, stinging pellets, and mud sucked at her boots. The wind tried to push her back, but she fought it, holding the lantern high. Its glow flickered wildly, barely cutting the gloom. At the stable doors, she found Thomas Hartwell and two of the younger grooms struggling to hold Wellington in his stall, but it was hopeless. The black stallion was wild with terror and something else. Purpose, maybe, or desperate knowing. He reared, lashing out with his hooves, sweat glistening on his coat despite the cold. "We can't hold him, Miss Ashworth," Thomas shouted over the roar of the wind. "He'll break his neck!" Charlotte's heart clenched. She had never seen Wellington like this. He kicked at the half-shattered stall door, his eyes rolling white, breath hissing between bared teeth. The other horses screamed and stomped, feeding off his panic. Before anyone could move, Wellington reared again and crashed his powerful chest against the door. With a splintering crack, the old oak gave way. The stallion bolted into the night, his black form swallowed almost instantly by rain and darkness. Charlotte didn't hesitate. She tore after him, ignoring Thomas's calls and the warnings of the grooms. Lightning split the sky, briefly turning the estate into a world of stark shadows. She could see Wellington galloping toward the far edge of the property, heading for the ancient forest that bordered Pembroke land, Sherwood Forest, a place tangled with family history and old stories. Without thinking, Charlotte plunged after him. Branches whipped her face and snatched at her clothes as she stumbled down the overgrown path. She lost a boot in the mud, but didn't stop to retrieve it. Her lantern guttered and died, leaving her with only the intermittent flashes of lightning to guide her. The ground was slick and treacherous, tree roots rising from the earth like clutching fingers. Still, she pressed on, driven by a force stronger than fear. Somewhere ahead, she caught glimpses of Wellington, a flash of black against the silver-lit trees, a glimpse of his wild, rolling eyes. He crashed through the underbrush, heedless of thorns and fallen logs, leading her deeper into the heart of the ancient woods. The storm seemed to intensify around them, wind tearing at the treetops, thunder rolling like cannon fire above. For a moment, Charlotte lost sight of him entirely. She paused, chest heaving, fighting to catch her breath. "Wellington!" she cried into the howling night. "Please, wait!" Then, as if in answer, a shrill whinny pierced the storm. Charlotte turned and saw him at the crest of a small rise, mane plastered to his neck, rain streaming down his flanks. He stood perfectly still, staring into a darkness that felt bottomless. Charlotte slogged up the muddy slope, her feet numb and bleeding, every muscle in her body aching. She reached Wellington's side and pressed a trembling hand to his neck, feeling his powerful heart racing beneath her palm. He nudged her, almost urgently, then started forward again, slowly this time, as if inviting her to follow. Charlotte did, barely aware of the storm anymore, all her senses focused on the strange certainty that Wellington was leading her somewhere she was meant to go. The forest here was older than the estate itself, the trees huge and gnarled, their roots entwined like ancient hands. Charlotte had only been this deep into Sherwood Forest once, as a child, listening to her father's tales of family secrets and lost treasures. Tonight, the stories seemed almost real, shadows moving between the trunks, eyes watching from the darkness. Wellington picked his way along a faint, overgrown path that Charlotte barely remembered. The wind died down as they entered a clearing, replaced by the steady drumming of rain on leaves. In the center of the clearing stood an old cabin, half collapsed and covered in ivy, its windows dark, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. This was the hunting cabin, once the pride of the Pembroke family, abandoned generations ago and left to rot among the trees. No one ever came here anymore. Except, it seemed, Wellington. The stallion walked straight to the cabin's door and stopped, stamping his hoof. He whickered softly, turning to look at Charlotte with eyes that seemed almost human in their intensity. She approached, hands shaking, and pushed the door open. It groaned on its hinges, the sound swallowed by the storm. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, but Charlotte's eyes quickly adjusted. Old hunting trophies and dusty furniture loomed in the gloom. On a battered table, half hidden beneath a sheet of moldy canvas, lay something unexpected, a battered, leather-bound journal. Charlotte reached out, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. The name on the cover, written in a familiar, hurried hand, sent a jolt through her heart. Alexander Pembroke. She sank into the nearest chair, the storm raging around her, Wellington standing guard at the door, and opened the journal with trembling fingers. In that instant, Charlotte knew that this night, this wild, impossible night, had changed the course of everything. And outside, as the thunder rolled and the rain washed away old secrets, the past and future seemed to twist together, drawing her toward a truth she could never have imagined. The storm's fury faded into a steady rhythm against the roof as Charlotte sat in the shadowy hunting cabin, the battered journal open in her lap. The air inside was thick with dust, old wood, and the ghost of fires that had burned there generations before. Wellington stood just inside the doorway, head lowered, sides still heaving from his desperate flight through the woods. He watched her with eyes full of intelligence and worry, as if he too sensed the gravity of this moment. Charlotte's fingers shook as she turned the first page. The journal was worn, its edges curled and stained by time. But Alexander's handwriting leapt from the yellowed paper, bold, slanted, unmistakably his. She pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting tears. For a moment she just let herself feel the ache of longing, the relief of finding something, anything left of him, and the eerie certainty that Wellington had led her here for a reason. The first entries were simple. Daily life, notes about the estate, brief sketches of his fellow officers, a few lines about Wellington's training. She read about the early days in the Royal Horse Guards, the pride and nerves Alexander felt as a new captain, the odd mix of terror and exhilaration he described before every deployment. There were mentions of her, too. Charlotte's name slipped into sentences like a secret, a charm against fear. Charlotte says Wellington has more sense than I do, he'd written once. And she's probably right. He knows when I'm bluffing. She does, too. Charlotte let out a soft laugh, half sob at the memory. She could picture Alexander's lopsided grin, the way he'd tease her in the stable yard, making even the dullest day seem lit from within. The words blurred on the page as she blinked away tears, but as she read on, the entries changed. The tone darkened. Dates skipped. Whole weeks lost to battle. Alexander's handwriting grew more hurried, sentences running into one another. He wrote about the desert heat, the constant vigilance, the way the line between friend and enemy sometimes blurred in the dust and noise. Names appeared. Soldiers she'd never met, a few lost in the same scrawled lines in which they were introduced. The writing trembled with exhaustion and longing, with a desperate hope that this tour would be his last. Then, near the back of the journal, Charlotte found the entry that stopped her heart. "If you're reading this," Alexander had written, "I pray it means I made it home. But if not, if something kept me, know that I kept my promise in every way I could. I have always believed that Wellington would be the first to know if I was coming back. We had a place, the first place we ever hid together as children. If I'm lost, look there. He will show you." Charlotte stared at the words, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the book. The cabin. Of course, the hiding place from their childhood. The spot they'd claimed as their secret world long before war, duty, or heartbreak had darkened their lives. She remembered sneaking out on summer afternoons, giggling as Alexander led her through these same woods to the little cabin where they played at knights and explorers, Wellington's dam trailing behind, heavy with foal. It was their place of safety, the center of a world that made sense. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters, jolting Charlotte back to the present. She looked at Wellington, who met her gaze with quiet certainty. He stamped his hoof once, as if urging her to hurry. Charlotte stood, the journal clutched tight in her hand. The fear that had haunted her all night gave way to something fiercer, determination, a resolve as solid as the ground beneath her. Whatever had happened to Alexander, she would find him. The thought that he might be alive somewhere, trying to return to her, sent hope surging through her veins. She pushed open the creaking door and stepped out into the clearing, Wellington at her side. The rain had slowed, though the forest still glistened with water and reflected the pale, eerie light of dawn. Charlotte hurried back along the muddy path, her boots squelching in the soft earth. The woods were silent now, except for the quiet shuffle of Wellington's hooves beside her. The storm's anger had passed, but in its wake was a deep, humming tension, something unresolved, waiting. As they neared the edge of the woods, Charlotte paused, breathless, and looked down the old path that ran alongside a rocky streambed. It was barely visible now, overgrown with brambles and nettles, but she recognized it instantly. This was the way they used to go as children, the shortcut to the hidden glen where Alexander had once carved their initials into a beech tree. She hesitated, heart thudding. Wellington stepped forward, nudging her gently, urging her on. Charlotte took a steadying breath and followed him, forcing her way through the undergrowth. Each step felt like moving through a dream, memories and present danger mixing together until she could no longer tell one from the other. The path opened into a small, secluded hollow. The stream gurgled nearby, swollen with rain, and wildflowers bent under the weight of water. In the center of the glen stood the beech tree, still scarred with the initials A+C. Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes. How many years had passed since she'd stood here laughing, safe, with Alexander beside her? Wellington's ears twitched. He moved forward, sniffing the ground intently, then began to circle the edge of the clearing, searching for something Charlotte could not see. She knelt at the base of the tree, running her fingers over the rough bark, when she noticed a patch of disturbed earth just a few feet away, a place where the grass had been trampled, the soil churned up as if by desperate hands. She dropped to her knees and began to dig, her fingers numb, scraping away mud and roots. Wellington stood over her, breathing softly, his body tense. Charlotte's hands closed around something cold and metallic buried beneath the soil, a battered dog tag, its surface smeared with dirt, but clearly engraved. Pembroke A. Charlotte gasped, clutching the tag to her chest. She looked up at Wellington, whose eyes shone with the same wild hope that suddenly blazed in her heart. Alexander had been here, recently. He'd left a sign, just as he promised. Hope surged through her, fierce and electrifying. Somewhere, somehow, Alexander was alive. The forest, once a place of secrets and fear, was now charged with possibility. Charlotte pressed the dog tag into her palm, whispered a silent prayer, and resolved that whatever it took, she would not stop until she brought him home. With Wellington standing guard beside her and the promise of love burning in her chest, Charlotte rose from the muddy earth, the first rays of morning breaking through the trees, determined to follow the path that fate and a loyal horse had laid before her. The morning after the storm had a raw, uncertain beauty. A heavy silence blanketed the woods, broken only by the soft calls of waking birds and the ceaseless rush of water in the swollen stream. Charlotte stood in the glen, Alexander's dog tag clenched tightly in her hand. Mud streaked across her palms and face, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear nothing else. Wellington, his coat still slick with rain, stood beside her, every muscle tense, eyes scanning the shadows as if searching for someone just out of sight. She pressed the dog tag to her lips, trembling. Alexander had been here. Maybe he was close. Maybe, Charlotte bit back the flood of hope. She couldn't afford to waste time on tears. Not now. She pulled herself up, shoving the tag into her pocket, then gripped Wellington's mane for strength. Her boots squelched in the soft ground as she turned to the edge of the clearing. The dog tag meant Alexander was alive. Recently, at least. But if he was injured, lost, or worse, every moment could matter. The image of him somewhere in these woods, alone and hurt, set her blood racing. "Come on, Wellington." Her voice was ragged, but the stallion needed no urging. He moved forward, lowering his nose to the damp earth, sniffing and snorting, searching for some invisible sign. Charlotte followed, the two of them pushing deeper into the tangled undergrowth. Branches whipped at her arms and legs, thorns snagging her dress and drawing beads of blood, but she barely noticed. She kept her eyes locked on Wellington, trusting him more than she trusted her own senses. The forest here felt different, older, wilder, as if it had never truly belonged to the estate or its owners. The light filtering through the high canopy was strange, green and watery, turning every movement into a shadow play. Once, a startled fox darted across their path, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Somewhere nearby, a crow cawed, its cry echoing through the trees with an unsettling finality. Every few minutes, Charlotte stopped to listen. The only sounds were Wellington's breath and the quick thump of her own heart. Then, faint, almost lost in the rush of water, came another sound. Charlotte froze, holding her breath. Was it the wind? Or something else? A groan, a cough, the sound of a man struggling to breathe? She hurried forward, nearly tripping over a root, pushing through a thicket of brambles. Wellington stopped at the edge of a steep, muddy bank, his nostrils flaring. He whickered softly, stamping his hoof. Charlotte knelt beside him, straining to see through the tangle of brush below. There, sprawled half-hidden among the reeds and stones at the edge of the swollen creek, lay a figure, a man unmoving, his uniform torn and stained, one arm twisted beneath him. Charlotte's heart seized. Alexander. She slid down the embankment, grabbing for branches and rocks to slow her descent. Wellington paced anxiously at the top, calling to her with low, urgent sounds. Charlotte crashed through the last tangle of brush and fell to her knees beside the man. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, eyes closed, lips cracked and dry. He wore the remnants of his Royal Horse Guards jacket, now little more than rags. Charlotte's hands flew to his throat, searching desperately for a pulse. For a terrifying moment, she felt nothing. "No, no, please, Alexander!" Then, faint but undeniable, a flutter. His heart was still beating. Relief crashed over her, hot and dizzying. Tears sprang to her eyes, blurring the world. She shook his shoulder gently at first, then more insistently. "Alexander, it's me." Charlotte, can you hear me? He groaned, eyelids fluttering. For a second, she thought he'd slip away, but then he turned his head, blinking slowly. His lips parted, the barest ghost of a smile flickering across his face. Charlotte, you found me. His voice was no more than a whisper, but it was enough. She squeezed his hand, choking back tears. I never stopped looking. We're going to get you home, do you hear me? You're coming home. He tried to move, but a grimace of pain twisted his features. She quickly surveyed his injuries. Deep gash on his temple, blood caked along his hairline, his left leg bent at an odd angle. The jacket was soaked through, not only with rain, but with the dark stain of old wounds. Charlotte's hands trembled as she tore strips from her petticoat, binding his head and trying to slow the bleeding. Stay with me, Alexander. Please. You're safe now. He squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with exhaustion and gratitude. Wellington knew I'd be here, didn't he? Charlotte looked up the bank, where the stallion's black head loomed, eyes never leaving them. She smiled through tears. He never stopped believing. Neither did I. The forest around them seemed to breathe again. A breeze whispered through the leaves, gentler now, and the heavy tension of the stormy night began to ebb. But Charlotte knew they weren't safe yet. Alexander was weak, barely conscious. The estate was far, the path treacherous, and the sun already slipping toward the horizon. She tried to help Alexander stand, but he cried out in pain, his leg too injured to bear any weight. Don't, he gasped. Leave me, Charlotte. Get help. Never. I'm not leaving you. Not now, not ever. Wellington whinnied from above, pawing at the earth as if urging her to find a way. Charlotte wiped her eyes, forcing herself to focus. She tore her shawl into more strips, making crude bandages, then wedged herself under Alexander's arm, trying to lift him. He sagged against her, teeth clenched, sweat beading on his forehead. Every few steps, she had to stop, gasping for breath, but she refused to give up. Inch by inch, she dragged him up the bank, Wellington pacing beside them, head lowered in concern. When she finally reached the top, she collapsed, muscles shaking. Alexander slipped in and out of consciousness, lips moving with feverish, half-remembered words. Her name, Wellington's name, and snatches of childhood stories. Charlotte pressed her forehead to his, whispering promises into the dusk. I'm here. We'll get through this. I swear it. She looked to Wellington, desperation mingling with hope. Help us, boy. Please, show me what to do. As if understanding, Wellington knelt, lowering himself awkwardly onto the muddy ground. A gesture no one had ever taught him, something born of pure instinct and love. Charlotte, barely daring to hope, struggled to help Alexander onto the horse's back, securing him as best she could with the remains of her shawl and her own body. Wellington rose, Alexander slumped across his broad back, Charlotte clutching his side for balance. With a final look at the clearing, the initials carved into the beach and the blood-soaked earth, they set off. One wounded soldier, one determined woman, and one extraordinary horse, into the gathering night, following the trail home. Charlotte's legs burned with exhaustion, but her heart soared with gratitude and awe. She pressed her cheek to Wellington's neck, whispering thanks, prayers, and 1,000 silent promises. In that moment, as the estate lights flickered in the distance, hope blazed brighter than any storm. They were not defeated. They were going home, together. The night pressed in around them, the air thick with the smell of rain and the iron tang of blood. Charlotte gripped Wellington's mane with one hand, the other arm wrapped tight around Alexander's battered body as the horse moved carefully through the forest. Every step was slow, deliberate. Wellington seemed to know that the man on his back was more fragile than ever before. Every jolt or stumble a new risk. Charlotte's own legs trembled with exhaustion and cold, but she didn't care. Nothing else in the world mattered now but keeping Alexander alive, keeping him moving one heartbeat at a time. The woods that had felt so wild and foreboding in the storm now took on a different character. The trees loomed protectively overhead, their branches sheltering the three travelers from the worst of the wind. In the distance, a nightingale began to sing, its plaintive melody weaving through the hush of the woods, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, beauty could still survive. Alexander drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath shallow, his face pale in the moonlight that filtered through the canopy. More than once, Charlotte felt panic rising in her chest as he slumped forward, but each time she called his name, he responded with a faint squeeze of her hand or a whispered word. Charlotte. Home. She squeezed back, whispering encouragement, fighting to keep his eyes open and his spirit anchored to this world. Wellington pressed on, never faltering. Mud clung to his legs, brambles tugged at his tail, but he was relentless, following an instinct deeper than memory or training. When the path narrowed and roots threatened to trip him, he slowed to a careful walk. When the undergrowth thickened, he shifted his weight, shouldering through with the quiet power of a horse who had once carried royalty into battle. Every so often, he would glance back at Charlotte, eyes full of something that felt like understanding, a promise that he would not let them down. At the edge of the woods, the fields of Pembroke Estate rolled out before them, silver in the moonlight, dotted with the black shapes of sleeping cattle and the ghostly outlines of distant hedges. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind a raw, living silence. In the distance, the manor house glowed with warm, golden light. Charlotte's heart ached at the sight. Home was so close, but still a world away. She called out, her voice ragged, desperate, hoping someone in the house or among the staff might hear her. But the wind swallowed her words. She was on her own. Wellington seemed to sense her fear. He picked up his pace, trotting now, head high, nostrils flared, the proud stallion's strength returning in every stride. As they crossed the last pasture, lights flickered on in the outbuildings. Far off, a dog barked. Charlotte cried out again, this time with all the hope and terror in her heart. Help! Please! Someone! We need help! At the sound of her voice, Thomas Hartwell came running from the barn, his nightshirt flapping in the wind, lanterns swinging wildly. Behind him rushed a handful of stable boys and Lady Pembroke herself, wrapped in a heavy cloak, her hair coming loose around her face. Thomas froze at the sight of Wellington, his eyes widening as he took in the battered, slumped form across the horse's back. My God, is it? Charlotte nodded, tears streaming down her face. It's Alexander. He's alive, but he's hurt. We need a doctor, quickly. Everything happened at once. Thomas and one of the grooms rushed forward, helping Charlotte ease Alexander from Wellington's back. He moaned softly, eyes fluttering as they carried him toward the house. Lady Pembroke fell to her knees beside her son, pressing kisses to his forehead, whispering frantic prayers of thanks. Charlotte followed, her limbs numb, her mind spinning with exhaustion and disbelief. Inside the manor, the household sprang to life. Hartwell barked orders, hot water, clean bandages, whiskey for the pain. Someone ran for the village doctor. Lady Pembroke held Alexander's hand while Charlotte bathed his wounds, cleaning the blood and mud from his skin. For hours, she worked with single-minded focus, her hands never shaking, her mind refusing to accept any outcome except survival. When the doctor arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, he took over. He set Alexander's broken leg, stitched the gash on his head, and pronounced him, miraculously, likely to recover, if only he was kept warm and given time to heal. Charlotte finally let herself collapse beside the fire in Alexander's old room, her eyes never leaving his face. Wellington stood just outside the window, his dark head lowered as if standing vigil. The estate staff whispered about the miracle, the prodigal son found, the loyal horse who'd brought him home through the storm. But for Charlotte, it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like the result of loyalty, of love, of never giving up even when the world seemed determined to break her spirit. She watched Alexander sleep, his breath finally deep and even, and felt her own breath start to slow, her body relaxing for the first time in days. Dawn crept across the fields, pink and gold, bathing the manor in gentle light. Wellington remained at his post until Charlotte herself came to thank him, running her fingers through his tangled mane, pressing her forehead to his strong, warm neck. "We did it, old friend. You saved him. You saved all of us." Wellington nickered softly, his breath warming her cheek. She closed her eyes and let the peace of that moment sink into her bones. The estate awoke to a new day, one that would be remembered not just for its terror and hardship, but for the triumph that followed. Villagers gathered at the gates, word of Alexander's return spreading like wildfire. Lady Pembroke and Charlotte took turns sitting at his bedside, reading letters aloud, telling stories, reminding him of all the reasons he had to fight. Outside, Wellington grazed in the sunlit pasture, every so often lifting his head to the window where Alexander slept. If anyone doubted the power of loyalty, of hope, or of the mysterious bond between horse and man, they had only to look at Wellington and remember that night, the storm, the journey, and the miracle of coming home. And for Charlotte, there was no question left in her heart. Whatever storms might come in the future, she knew now that she could face them. As long as there was love and loyalty and the courage to never stop searching, there would always be hope. The sun had long climbed above the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, casting golden light over Pembroke Estate, where Alexander lay recovering in the quiet warmth of his room. Outside, Wellington grazed peacefully in the pasture, his coat gleaming under the midday sun, a silent sentinel to the homecoming he had made possible. Yet beneath this peaceful scene lay a story far richer and more profound, a story not only of human love and devotion, but of the remarkable bond between man and horse, woven from instincts, emotions, and history. To understand what had transpired, the way Wellington had seemingly known Alexander was alive and guided Charlotte through the storm to find him, experts say we must look deeper into the mysterious world of animal intelligence and emotional connection. Dr. Eleanor Grant, a leading animal behaviorist from the University of Cambridge, has spent years studying the complex relationships between horses and humans. She explains that while the idea of a horse sensing a missing rider may sound like folklore, it is firmly grounded in science. Horses are incredibly perceptive creatures, Dr. Grant says in a calm, measured tone. They are highly attuned to their environment and to the emotional states of the humans around them. This sensitivity is a survival mechanism. They're prey animals, so being able to read subtle cues is essential for avoiding danger. But this sensitivity also extends to forming deep, lasting bonds with specific individuals. Wellington's behavior, Dr. Grant suggests, was not just loyalty in the romantic sense, but a profound example of what scientists call emotional contagion. The capacity of animals to resonate with and respond to the emotions of another being. When Alexander went missing, she explains, Wellington would have been exposed to the stress and anxiety of the people around him. Charlotte, the estate staff, even Alexander himself during his letters home. Horses can pick up on these emotional states, often responding with increased vigilance or distress. In Wellington's case, it seems he was also able to use his homing instincts, the innate ability to navigate over long distances and recognize familiar territory, to seek out Alexander. This combination of emotional intelligence and navigational skill is rare but not unheard of. History is peppered with stories of horses and other animals who have found their way back to injured or lost owners, driven by an almost inexplicable connection. Take the example of the elephant graveyard phenomenon, Dr. Grant continues. Certain animals, including elephants and horses, have been observed returning to places linked to past experiences or the remains of other animals. This suggests a level of memory and spatial awareness that goes beyond simple survival instincts. Wellington's journey through Sherwood Forest and beyond was, in many ways, a testament to this extraordinary ability. He used memories of childhood paths and hidden places, combined with his keen senses, to navigate the treacherous woods and find Alexander. But more than that, he responded to the subtle emotional signals that Alexander was alive, in pain, and in need of help. Charlotte herself noted that Wellington's behavior changed drastically as news of Alexander's disappearance spread. Before the news, Wellington was calm and routine, she reflects. But after, he grew restless, almost frantic. He paced, refused to eat, and then finally broke free in the storm. It was as if he knew something was wrong, something she and I didn't yet understand. Dr. Grant emphasizes that while it's tempting to attribute such behavior to supernatural intuition, the truth is rooted in a deep biological and emotional complexity. Horses are social animals. Their brains are wired for connection, for communication. The bond between a horse and a human is forged over time, through mutual trust and interaction. This bond can lead to behaviors that look like heroism, guiding, protecting, alerting, but are really the result of evolved emotional responsiveness. The Cambridge researcher also points out that this bond benefits both parties. For humans, horses have long been companions, partners in labor and war, and sources of comfort and healing. For horses, the relationship offers security, routine, and social interaction, crucial for animals that thrive in herds. Wellington's loyalty was a survival mechanism, but also an emotional imperative. He was protecting the one who had protected him. This extraordinary partnership between horse and human has been mirrored throughout history, in stories both legendary and everyday. From the cavalry horses of the World Wars to farm horses and therapy animals today, the mutual understanding between species continues to inspire and move people around the world. Back at Pembroke Estate, this truth was not lost on those who had witnessed Wellington's journey. Lady Pembroke, reflecting on her son's recovery, spoke to Charlotte one afternoon as they watched Wellington and Alexander share a quiet moment in the pasture. "It's not just the strength of a man that brings him home," she said softly. "It's the strength of those who stand by him, even those with 4 legs and a heart as true as any." For Charlotte, this deeper understanding brought a sense of peace and awe. Wellington was not just a horse. He was a symbol of hope, of resilience, of love that transcended words and time. She thought often about the future, of Alexander's healing, of the estate returning to its old rhythms, of Wellington continuing his watchful presence. But she also knew that the lessons of this ordeal would stay with her forever. The power of loyalty, the unseen ties that bind, and the miracles born not just from chance, but from the fierce, quiet devotion of a true friend. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows over Pembroke's fields, Charlotte whispered a final promise to Wellington. "Thank you, old friend. You've shown us all what it means to never give up." And with that, the estate settled into twilight, the horse's silhouette standing tall against the fading light, the echo of thunder replaced by the steady beat of hearts bound together by trust, courage, and unbreakable loyalty. The golden light of the late afternoon bathed Pembroke Estate in warmth, softening the edges of the old stone buildings and setting the fields aglow like a painting come to life. The long journey through pain, uncertainty, and hope was finally reaching its peaceful crescendo. Alexander lay in the sunlit parlor, his wounds healing, his eyes bright with a quiet strength born of survival. Outside, Wellington grazed contentedly, the loyal black stallion whose courage and devotion had saved a life now basking in the calm of home. For Charlotte, the past weeks had been a whirlwind of emotion: fear, determination, despair, and finally, joy. Sitting by Alexander's side, she traced the line of his healing scars with gentle fingers and thought about the power that had carried them all through. Love. Not the fleeting kind whispered in fleeting moments, but a love forged in fire, tested by distance and hardship, sustained by the unyielding loyalty of a horse and the steadfast heart of a woman who refused to give up. The Pembroke family gathered in the grand hall for a quiet celebration, not of wealth or status, but of life itself. The villagers had come too, their faces shining with relief and gratitude. They spoke in hushed tones about the miracle of Alexander's return, of the horse who had defied the storm, the darkness, and the unknown to bring him home. Lord Pembroke raised a glass in a toast, his voice rich with emotion. To family, to courage, and to the unbreakable bond between man and beast. May we never forget the lessons Wellington has taught us all. Tears glistened in Lady Pembroke's eyes as she reached for Alexander's hand. He smiled softly, the weight of his trials visible but no longer burdensome. Charlotte caught his gaze, and in that moment, words were unnecessary. They had been through a storm that had changed them forever, but they had come out stronger, bound by love, hope, and an unwavering faith in each other. Weeks passed, and Alexander's strength returned. He took slow walks through the estate, Wellington always at his side. Their connection, so vivid in those desperate nights, deepened with every step. The horse that had carried him through the darkest hour was now a symbol of new beginnings. One radiant morning, the estate hosted a simple ceremony in the garden. Family and friends gathered under the blooming chestnut trees to witness the union of Alexander and Charlotte. Wellington stood proudly nearby, his sleek black coat shimmering in the sunlight, as if honoring the moment. As vows were exchanged, promises made and sealed with smiles and tears, the spirit of loyalty that had defined their journey resonated through every heart present. It was more than a wedding. It was a celebration of endurance, faith, and the transformative power of love. Charlotte whispered to Alexander as they stood beneath the sky, "We've weathered the storm, and now, together, we build something new." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the promise of all the tomorrows yet to come. In the months that followed, life at Pembroke Estate flourished anew. Wellington sired a foal, strong, curious, a living testament to the legacy of loyalty and love. The young horse galloped across the fields, free and unburdened, a symbol of hope's eternal renewal. Charlotte often found herself watching Wellington and the foal play, marveling at the simple miracles that spring from faith and devotion. She carried with her the lessons learned in those dark days, the resilience to endure, the courage to believe, and the unshakable bond that connects souls across even the widest divides. At night, when the stars blanketed the sky and the estate settled into quiet, Charlotte would sit by the window, whispering thanks for the journey they had survived. She knew that true love was not just about grand gestures or promises made in light, but about the strength to keep going when the world seemed lost. And Wellington, the horse who had become legend, stood watch beside her, a guardian of hope, a symbol of what it means to never give up. If you believe in the power of loyalty and love, if you've ever witnessed a bond that defies logic and time, share this story. Let it remind us all that sometimes the greatest miracles come from the quiet hearts that refuse to surrender. Because in the end, love is what brings us home.